Hello, I'm Martin Lewis, Senior Lecturer Emeritus in the Department of History at Stanford University, and this is the second half of my lecture on the history and geography of alcohol, which in turn is part of a larger lecture series that I'm doing on the history and geography of natural, psychoactive, or mind-altering substances. I'll pick up where I left off in the first half of the lecture on alcohol. I went up through the creation of all sorts of naturally fermented products, but what I want to talk about today is distilled alcohol or other kinds of stronger alcoholic drinks. So natural fermentation generally does not allow you to get a drink stronger than 18 or 20%, and actually more often about 12% alcoholic content by volume. The reason why is because as alcohol builds up, it will kill off the yeast that runs the fermentation process itself. The easiest method of exceeding this natural limit is through what is known as fractional freezing, but the most efficient and by far the most common method is through distillation. So I'll just briefly touch on the first and I'll focus on the second. So fractional freezing is based on the fact that water freezes at a lower temperature than alcohol. So if you lightly freeze an alcoholic beverage and remove the ice, you can strengthen it. You can get alcoholic content up to about 25 or 40%, but as you can see on this slide with Eisbach beer, which is strengthened in this way, is only about 12% alcohol, because beer generally you can't get stronger than about 8% or so through traditional fermentation. So this was done fairly extensively in many parts of the world, particularly I would say in early United States and parts of Europe, before distillation became common. Well, it's much easier to do than distillation, so it's much more easily done at the home scale. I talked in the first lecture on alcohol quite a bit about the importance of hard cider, and so I just want to touch on this a little bit. So Applejack, which was originally this stronger form of hard cider made by fractional freezing, was very important in early United States. And I'll just give you one slide here on the 1840 presidential election, which was one of the most interesting and crucial presidential elections in U.S. history. A couple of 8 years before, the U.S. presidential politics was greatly changed when Andrew Jackson won the presidency and focused on a populist campaign, stressing his origins and the frontier and separation from Eastern elite culture, if you will. And in 1840, the Whig candidate, the opponent of Jackson, actually running against his successor, Martin Van Buren, focused his campaign on his log cabin upbringing and hard cider drinking ways of life, which was really a disingenuous campaign. William Henry Harrison was actually from an elite family. His father had signed the Declaration of Independence. He had a large commercial farm. He had spent a few years in a log cabin, and evidently he did like hard cider. But so it was a campaign that was designed to appeal to the common person or common man, since women were not allowed to vote at that time. And it's stressing also his American roots. And he claimed that his opponent, Martin Van Buren, who had been really probably the most important architect of the Democratic Party that Andrew Jackson is usually credited with forming. I'd say they're probably equally important. But anyway, William Henry Harrison accused Van Buren of being an elite wine drinker who drank imported wines from Europe. So it was sort of a populist message, and it was quite successful. But the campaign just focused very extensively on hard cider, as you could see here. Also to note was at the same time, distilled spirits were taking off in the United States and in many other countries. Well, it had actually already taken off. Rum was a very important drink in colonial New England and other parts of the country. And I have here just a snippet of a graph. We'll see this graph in its full form later on, but I cut it off just to show you the situation from about 1840 to 1860, and you could see how much spirits, meaning basically either applejack or generally distilled spirits, how much more widely consumed they were than wine or beer. Wine was almost negligible in terms of total consumption. Now, if you note on this graph, there's no mention of hard cider, let alone applejack. These are sort of semi-forgotten drinks. But another problem was hard cider was usually produced at home. Frontier families and other farm families grew apples and made hard cider and sometimes made applejack. And so the products were part of a subsistence system and were not often not sold on the market and often sort of escaped official overview. Not always. But anyway, we'll look at this graph later on. Now, going back a little bit to the history of distillation, there are different kinds of stills. I'll focus on the alembic still, which is the most common kind used with most commercial drinks, and that became the major method of distillation in Europe and in the Americas as well. So it is similar in a way to the creation of applejack through fractional freezing, but this instead is based on the fact that alcohol will vaporize at a lower temperature than water. So you heat a mixture of water and alcohol, and the alcoholic vapors will vaporize. The alcohol will vaporize first. You can cool that down, and then it will condense into a more alcohol-rich liquid. Still, distillation has a long history. It was known in ancient Rome. It was known in ancient China. It was very inefficient, though, in this early period. Efficient stills had not been developed. And it was used for very high-value goods, particularly things like perfume. And we can see in this illustration a diagram of distillation equipment from the 3rd century of the Common Era from a later Byzantine Greek manuscript. Intriguingly, effective distillation was developed in the Islamic world by Muslim alchemists in the probably 8th or 9th century. The first written description is by the very well-known Muslim scholar Al-Kindi. Jabir ibn Hayyan sometimes is said to have been the first master of distillation, but it's not even we're not even sure if he was an actual person. There's a number of alchemical works that are attributed to him, so he's often said to have been the first researcher, if you will, to classify chemical substances and to derive inorganic compounds from organic substances by chemical means. But there's a lot of uncertainty here. But what is certain is that these Muslim alchemists, who were motivated not to create hard alcoholic drinks so much as to explore the chemical world with the hope of eventually being able to turn base metals into gold and do other sorts of miraculous things, but they were experimenting wisely and developed pretty effective distillation. It spread pretty widely. Again, we think it originated in the Muslim world, but quite early on, distillation was being done in China, and distillation for alcoholic beverages, not simply as part of a alchemical experimentation. The stills used in China are quite different from the alembic stills used in the West and in the Muslim world. We'll look at some of those later on. So there might be some doubt about this, but as you can see from this little bit of text that comes from a commercial guide for Baiju, which is distilled rice wine, essentially. And it's still quite commonly consumed in China and very similar things in other East Asian countries. But you note, if you read here, you'll see that it became a drink beloved of farmers and workers, while undistilled rice wine was the most important for the elite. But it did become important and continued to be important and is to this day. But if we look back at Europe, we see that distillation of wine originally was developed, like in the Muslim world, by alchemists who were searching for greater things. but we're doing a lot of experimentation. It seems to, distillation seems to have moved pretty early into monasteries, which, as I mentioned before, were very important in beer brewing and the creation of and winemaking and other alcoholic endeavors. It may seem surprising that they were distilling alcohol, but they were using it for medical or supposedly medical purposes. That was one thing that monasteries and nunneries were interested in. The illustration here, though, is not perfect. It's not showing a monastic environment by any means, but it does show some fairly crude stills, and it is also showing some herbal ingredients which were used not so much as flavorings, but as medicinals. The idea that a very strong alcoholic drink, particularly one that had medicinal herbal material in it, could be an important cure or ameliorative drink for certain illnesses. It was in the 1400s or 15th century when distillation really began to spread pretty rapidly in the common population as a way of making very strong alcoholic drinks. And by the year 1500, this was well publicized, and scholars often link it to Hieronymus Brunswick's book on called the Book of the Art of Distillation out of Simple Ingredients, which was well illustrated and was used by many people to learn how to do this pretty involved and intricate process. So at this time, roughly 1400 to 1500, distillation of alcoholic beverages to make stronger drinks became quite common in Europe. And you ended up pretty quickly with a number of different principal categories of distilled spirits. And I'll run through them and give a little more information on each one later on in the lecture. So these would be brandy distilled from wine or other fruit alcoholic beverages, whiskey from malted grains, rum from fermented molasses, sugar-based, gin, like whiskey, derived from grain alcohols, but removing a lot of the natural flavors and adding botanical flavors, initially, again, for medicinal purposes. Vodka, strongly associated with Russia and Poland in the early period. Again, a grain distillate, but with real effort to minimize the flavor, get it as clean as possible. And then tequila and mezcal from Mexico in the New World, distilled from fermented agave juice or sap. So just starting from brandy, the term in English is shortened from brandy wine, which in turn was derived from the Dutch term, basically meaning burnt wine. So burning through the, not burning, but heating would be more accurate. And it looks like brandy, originally was a medicinal drink, but when it became a popular drink, it was seems like it was often done to ease the burden of transporting wine and to reduce taxation, because it was often taxed on volume. And if you concentrate the alcohol, you could get the same amount of alcohol for less taxation, because it wasn't based on the alcohol content, but on the overall volume. So originally, brandy was often wine that was distilled, transported, and then watered down to make something more like the original wine. It was not particularly good tasting, though. Hard alcohol that comes out of a still is usually very harsh. And it was quickly discovered, though, that if the brandy was aged in wooden barrels, that would improve the flavor. Aging in bottles doesn't do much of anything, but aging in wooden barrels does. And so brandy began to take off and become a popular drink in its own right. It was widely exported. France, obviously a very important exporting country, but Eastern European countries like Bulgaria, Romania, or a little further afield, Georgia, developed their own traditions in distilling wine and making brandies. It was exported very early on to Western Africa as part of the slave trade. Later would be replaced by rum, but enslaved people were often purchased with alcohol or with guns, or with cotton textiles from India. But alcohol and hard liquor, I should say, was very important. West Africans had their own alcoholic traditions of making alcoholic beverages, but it didn't include distillation, so you couldn't get the really hard drink. Today, France has noted brandy regions, just like it has very important wine regions. This map just has three. On the north, and mostly in Normandy, is Calvados, which is distilled hard cider. And in the first lecture on alcohol, I noted the distinction between the cider drinking, wine drinking, and beer drinking regions in France. So Normandy, like Brittany, is definitely in the cider drinking region, a little too cold for grapes. But it's interesting, Calvados is produced in very large oak vessels, and supposedly that is done to minimize the oak flavor and to retain the aroma of apples. Better known in the United States probably are Cognac and Armagnac. These are regions. Cognac has to be produced within that region to get the label. And these are wine brandies. Armagnac brandies supposedly have bolder, more complex aromas and flavors than cognacs, but I can't tell you anything more than that. Whiskey, notice the different spellings in the United States and Ireland with the E, and the rest of the world without that E. So whiskey is essentially fermented beer. I mean, that's generalizing quite a bit, but I think we could say that. Whiskey comes from an Irish term. I'm not sure how it is pronounced, but it could be literally translated to mean water of life. Early distilled beverages were often called water of life. Over much of Europe, aqua vitae is the Latin term. Still occasionally you'll come across this. And this, again, goes back to the early alchemical work. That's the word spirit, right, to talk about hard liquor as a spirit. There was the notion that there was this sort of spirit essence that was found in alcoholic beverages, that the alchemists were finding it, and they associated it with life, partly for its supposed health-giving benefits. Rather ironic, considering the health damage that it does. Anyway, whiskey can be made from barley, corn, rye, wheat, really any kind of grain. It's generally aged in charred oak vessels, often filtered after that. The first mention of whiskey, although it was a Latin text, so they're not using the Irish term, they're using the Latin term aqua vitae. But the first recorded instance of this very strong distilled alcohol in Ireland was from 1405, so quite early, and it's the death of a chiefdom, a political leader, from taking a surfeit too much. Aqua vitae at Christmas, rather ironic. So there are different kinds of whiskeys in the United States. There are federal regulations. Bourbon whiskey has to have at least 51% corn. It has to be aged in charred American white oak barrels. Corn whiskey is different. It has to be at least 80%. It's not aged. Corn whiskey is really sort of legal, if you buy it legally, moonshine, so it's a much cruder product. Malt whiskey is made from a mash at least 51% malted barley, which most beer is made out of. Rye, 51% rye, and so on. So there are these distinct regulations about the content and sometimes even how it's aged. Scotland is probably the best known place for distinctive regions of whiskey. When people go on whiskey drinking tours to distilleries, Scotland is a favorite place. Here we see a map with a number of distinctive kinds of Scotch whiskeys. They're usually distilled twice, sometimes even more. Some Scottish whiskeys or Scotch whiskeys are noted for their peaty taste, and that comes from drying the barley with peat fires, peat being accumulated sphagnum moss that grows in bogs and sort of what's on its way to becoming coal, but it's a very important fuel historically in poorer, wetter parts of the British Isles where there are a lot of bogs, blanket bogs, so in Ireland and Scotland. But not all Scotch whiskies have that peat flavor by any means. In the United States, the two states that are best known for whiskey, particularly bourbon whiskey, are Kentucky and Tennessee. You can see that on the map. So this map shows some important centers of whiskey production, but they're only outlying two states, and then they have an inset map in that circle to show the large number of important distilleries in several different places. There's a particular reason why these two states are noted for their whiskey production. One is they're located just west of the Appalachian Mountains, and when U.S. Frontier settlers were moving across the Appalachian Mountains, they often had a very difficult time marketing their grain, and from early days then they started fermenting it and distilling it to make it lightweight and easier to move over the crude road system of the time, and then it went on to become important centers. One thing I find very interesting is some of the most noted brands are produced in dry counties where alcohol drinking is illegal. Jack Daniel's, for example, you can see this from their own website. Dry county distillery tours. Yeah, you can walk through our hallowed hollow and learn something about the distillery without partaking in the mouth in this smooth sipping beverage, because the county does not allow any sort of alcoholic sales. Rather ironic. And just one more slide to focus on the historical role of whiskey in the frontier. After the United States was formed, its first major sort of geopolitical challenge was from settlers in western Pennsylvania, the far west, who were, again, growing grain, fermenting it, distilling it, and then shipping it to eastern markets to reduce the transportation costs. This is right after the Revolutionary War. The government was in debt, and the government, particularly under Alexander Hamilton, was coming up with new ideas to pay off that debt and offset it. So they instituted a pretty steep whiskey tax, and frontier settlers in Pennsylvania found this a threat to their livelihoods. They had a sort of a violent uprising. You could see that there were 3 to 4 of their own number killed. Some of the soldiers died who were pursuing them, but that was from illness or accidents, and 2 civilian deaths. And interesting, all the arrested protesters were eventually acquitted or pardoned. In the cities of New England at the time, whiskey had to compete with rum from the Caribbean. So rum is essentially fermented sugar. I mean, it's, you just put water and sugar, dissolve it, and you can ferment it. In creating sugar, the cane is squeezed, and then the juice is turned into molasses. In the colonial period, in the as early as the 17th century, 1600s, in Caribbean sugar plantations, it was discovered that you could turn molasses into a very potent alcoholic beverage. Well, you could ferment it, and then you could distill it. A lot of evidence suggests it was actually discovered by enslaved people themselves, and not the masters of the plantations, but it soon became very important. So the Caribbean was soon exporting quite a bit of rum to Europe, but also a lot of the raw molasses was exported to New England, and there was fermented and distilled. And according to Wikipedia, I'd like to actually track down this source, because I find it rather remarkable and almost hard to believe, but it states that in 1733, rum accounted for up to 80% of New England's exports, which is really extraordinarily high. In 1733, the British Parliament passed a Molasses Act to try to restrict the exports of molasses. They did not want the colonials engaged in this trade. Later, they had a Sugar Act that did something very similar. And these were some of the acts of Parliament that helped precipitate the American Revolutionary War. To what extent is obviously debatable. A lot of the rum made in New England was exported to West Africa for slaves, enslaved people. I did not make this map. I would have actually put that line to Africa further south of the slave coast rather than to what is now Mauritania, where not many people were enslaved, I should say. Although the arrow going back to the Americas from Senegambia. That's more accurate. But anyway, the so-called triangular slave involved the export of rum primarily, but other goods as well, from New England particularly to West Africa, to purchase enslaved people who were then exported, some to the Americas, some to what is now the United States, but mostly to the Caribbean, and then the sugar that the slaves produced sent to New England. Rum became very closely associated with naval enterprises, including piracy. I mean, everyone, I'm sure, have heard of pirate songs about rum. I mean, here we see a early illustration of pirates carrying rum to shore to purchase slaves on their own in West Africa. Rum became the main alcohol ration in the British Royal Navy. It was often watered down to create what was called grog. That was actually named from an individual. And that continued all the way till 1970, the Royal Navy having this daily rum ration. Now, gin has a little bit different history and lineage. Like brandy, it was developed to a certain fairly large extent by medieval monks and alchemists, again, as a medicinal drink. The main flavor in standard gin is juniper berries. Juniper berries are sort of semi-edible, but they were long used in traditional, well, even in formal medicine, supposedly for antiseptic, anti-inflammatory, and other properties. So they were used in a lot of medicinal products. And the idea with gin was to create as clean a tasting alcohol as possible, but then add these botanical ingredients, particularly juniper berries, to make it more medicinal. But as so often happens in the history of mind-altering substances, what begins as an medicinal or supposedly medicinal substance becomes a, if you will, recreational substance, and that happened pretty quickly for gin. It's hard to know exactly why, but in the 17th century Netherlands, it became very commonly consumed. That was 17th century was the golden age of the Dutch Republic, when the Dutch East India Company was bringing in vast amounts of money. It was by a pretty long shot the most prosperous state in Europe through most of the 17th century. Certainly on a per capita basis. The Dutch Republic was mostly Calvinist, and you might think of Calvinist Christians as having an antipathy to drink, and many of them did, but not all of them by any means, and certainly they were not teetotalers at that time. Well, some were, but there was quite a bit of alcohol consumed. It was brought to England in what is sometimes called the Glorious Revolution in 1688. That's when the English threw out their Stuart monarch, who was edging towards Catholicism, and brought in the Dutch politician William of Orange and his English wife Mary to become the joint monarchs, William and Mary. And that ushered in the age of parliamentary supremacy in England and later Britain, which is why it's called the Glorious Revolution by certain historians. But you had a Dutchman essentially on the throne of England at that time, and a view spread that, well, gin, this was a Dutch drink or a Protestant drink, unlike the brandy that was being brought in from France, a rival state and an enemy state often, and one associated with Catholicism. So gin spread rapidly. Gin was made in England, and it was made very cheaply, which was interesting. So through greater efficiencies in distillation, using any sort of grain, and then didn't have to be really high quality because the flavor came from the juniper berries and others. It spread across the classes and became a favored drink of lower poor people, particularly in London. And this was seen as a big problem. And I'll talk a little bit about two very famous illustrations from William Hogarth. On the left is Beer Street, and on the right is Gin Lane. These were very, very well-known illustrations at the time. So it takes a while to really interpret these two illustrations. If you look at Beer Street, it looks very healthy and prosperous, except that building on the right, which is falling apart. You look at Gin Lane, and it's a scene of horrors, except one building on the left, which is looks kept up well. Contrast those buildings on the right and left. Well, that's the pawn shop, because in Beer Street, which is a place of wholesome English living, where people are drinking beer and they're becoming happy, but they're not becoming dead drunk and they're not causing problems. The one business that is failing is the pawn shop, because people are not being driven to desperation and bankruptcy and don't have to pawn their goods. On the other hand, on Gin Street, the only business that is doing well is the pawn shop. And if you look carefully, a carpenter is pawning his saw and a woman is pawning her cooking pots. And then if we focus in a little bit more on Gin Lane, and I'm actually going to read the description. This is a Wikipedia description, which is pretty good. But most shockingly, the focus of the picture is a woman in the foreground who, addled by gin and driven to prostitution by her habit, as evidenced by the syphilitic sores on her leg, lets a baby slip unheeded from her arms and plunged to its death in the stairwell of the gin cellar below. Other images of despair and madness fill the scene. A disturbed man cavorts in the street, beating himself over the head with a pair of bellows while holding a baby impaled on a spike. The dead child's mother rushes from the house, screaming in horror. A barber has taken his own life in the dilapidated attic of the barber shop, ruined because nobody can afford a haircut or a shave. On the steps below, the woman who has let her baby fall, a skeletal pamphlet seller, rests, perhaps dead of starvation, as the unsold moralizing pamphlets on the evil of gin drinking, the downfall of Mrs. Gin, slips from his basket. Images of children on the path to destruction litter the scene. Aside from the dead baby on the spike, a child falling to his death, the baby is quieted by its mother with a cup of gin. And in the background of the scene, an orphan infant bawls naked on the floor as the body of its mother is loaded into a coffin. So these are exaggerated, no doubt, scenes of utter despair and horror, but they undoubtedly reflect a real reality, that there was a problem as English switched from drinking beer, which, well, you can certainly get drunk on beer, but it's depending on the potency, but it's very, very difficult to, for example, to kill yourself by drinking beer, where it's pretty relatively easy to do so on gin or other very strong distilled drinks. Or just to show you this is not unique to Hogarth, here's a quick another illustration from a little bit later on the Scourge of Gin, and you could see something very, very similar. Anyway, the gin craze, it's sometimes called, resulted in the Gin Act of 1751, which did not make gin illegal, but it prohibited gin distillers from selling to unlicensed merchants. It increased fees. It eliminated these small, very cheap gin shops. One of the things from Hogarth's print that I failed to mention, one of the signs in it says, on the gin shop says, drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pennies. So the idea of the Gin Act was to make distilled spirits more expensive, to reduce this kind of mass consumption. And evidently it was quite effective in that sense. And one of the things to note about gin is gin and tonic is a very popular drink. And this also has English, or I should say British, connotations, because this was the favored drink of British colonists in their tropical colonies. Any colony that had malaria, so it would have been pretty much most of India, Southeast Asia, most colonies in Africa, and many, many others. And by the mid-1800s, it was discovered, it had been discovered earlier, but it was popular, the use of quinine, which is a medicinal substance from a bark of trees in the Amazonian Andean rainforest region. The quinine will, if not prevent, can at least greatly reduce the occurrence and severity of malaria. And so the colonists were were taking quinine, which is very bitter, and putting it in very strong tasting gin would mask its taste. Today, tonic water just has traces of quinine, so it is bitter, but it's not like what it was, evidently. And just one other thing to note is there's been a global resurgence of gin since about 2010 with many, many different kinds of flavoring, not just juniper berries, but we're thinking rosemary and various other botanicals again. Vodka, like I said before, is closely associated with Russia and Poland originally, probably. It is sometimes said to be a potato distillate. You can find vodkas made of potatoes, but that's actually quite rare. Potatoes are starchy, don't have much sugar. You cannot malt them like you can most grains to convert the sugar to, to convert the starch to sugar, but you can convert it, but it's a more difficult process. So generally vodka is made out of grain, as is whiskey. Today, vodka producers have multiple rounds of very careful distillation. What they'll often do is sort of discard the very first of the distilled liquid and the very last of the distilled liquid, which has more chemical compounds. Often it's distilled so that it becomes very strong, too strong, and then it's watered down again. So the idea of vodka, classical vodka, would be to create as flavorless a drink as possible. But ironically, flavors are sometimes re-added or added at the end, botanical flavors. Probably the most famous is Zubrówka, a traditional Polish vodka. Well, hard to say how traditional it is. I think it's only been commercialized for about 100 years, but legend has it that it was done non-commercially earlier than that. But it's flavored with something that in Poland is referred to as bison grass. It comes from the only area in Europe where bison still live, the Wisent, or the European bison. And supposedly the bison like this grass. In the United States, it's more often called sweet grass. And sometimes in Europe, it's called holy grass. This kind of grass was used medicinally in many different cultures, certainly many Native American cultures. So I have the cover of the popular book, Braiding Sweetgrass, about indigenous wisdom and scientific knowledge, because it's an important part of the pharmacopoeia of many American Indian groups. It contains a substance called coumarin, which inhibits blood clotting, which can be a very effective medicinal use, but if used in excess can cause real problems too. So actually, it's interesting. Zubrówka was illegal in the United States until 2010, but the amount of coumarin is pretty small. Today, Russia and Poland are still at the core of the vodka drinking zone, although it has spread globally. And you can see the United States is pretty high. And there's a lot of curiosity about why vodka became the favored drink in Russia and then later in the Soviet Union, greatly overshadowing all others. Which has been a problem too, because there's a lot of alcoholism in Russia, and Russian drinking culture has often been geared towards taking straight shots of vodka pretty rapidly, which is the most dangerous way to drink in terms of health, in terms of social problems and the like. A lot of scholars have linked this to policies way back in the Imperial Russian or Tsarist time, when the state owned a number of distilleries and encouraged people to drink from these state-owned distilleries rather than producing their own alcohol or importing wine from Georgia or Moldova, places that later eventually became part of the Russian Empire. At one point, vodka was said to produce up to 40% of state revenue for Tsarist Russia. Again, I'm a little skeptical. It seems awfully high. But these are some of the reasons why vodka took off. Interestingly, today, there's been over the last half century or so, in Poland and more recently in Russia, a big push to substitute beer for vodka as a way to reduce public health dangers. For many reasons, beer is going to be, well, since it's so much less potent, it's going to be much less dangerous. In Poland, in the sort of last days of well, right after the communist period, essentially, when political parties were legalized, you have something called the Polish Beer Lovers Party. It's still around. It's sometimes considered a satirical party. Europe has a number of these satirical parties. Today it's sort of a green party, but its big emphasis was, let's not drink so much vodka, let's drink beer instead. And in Russia, same sort of thing has happened. And actually the evidence now suggests that Russians are drinking more beer than vodka. You get different information from different sources, but there's a lot that shows that there's a lot of vodka still consumed, but beer has become very important. And they have very different cultural connotations. Vodka drinking is associated more with the hardcore, let's get really drunk attitude. So anyway, we have, it's not just Russia but and Poland, but other places sort of we have changing alcohol regions in Europe. So this is a map, both these, this and the next map are from Wikipedia, but this one shows what are known as sort of the traditional alcohol regions of Europe, with a wine drinking region in the south and the southeast, a beer drinking region in the center, although including United Kingdom and Ireland, and then in the north and the east, a spirit drinking country, which is basically well, in many is vodka or something that is very, very similar to vodka, just has a different name, like aquavit. Interesting that they leave leaving Belarus and Moldova. Moldova would definitely be in the red wine drinking category. But anyway, in the same Wikipedia article, they have another map which is actually based on data from 2016. And it shows that some of the spirit drinking countries, like Sweden and Denmark, actually consume a lot more wine than they do distilled liquor. Very odd there to see, well, you see the United Kingdom in the wine drinking category. You see Spain in the beer drinking category. But anyway, in Russia, it's showing beer and vodka basically together. So that's an interesting map. If you look in the east, Georgia, definitely a wine drinking country. We talked about that in the first lecture. Armenia, on the other hand, more in terms of spirits. But of course, in a lot of places, it's, this is just what is the top, and there may be pretty similar levels of consumption. Second to last, I'll move to the New World to talk about tequila and mezcal. I talked about agave. These sort of cactus-like plants, century plants, some of them are sometimes called. Plants produce an awful lot of sweet sap, sugars that are used to produce a great big flower that comes up, maybe some cases 20 or 30 feet. It takes a lot of energy, so the plants store a lot of starch and sugar. You could just hollow out a mature agave plant, and the sap collects. It'll start to ferment almost immediately, and that'll give you pulque. And then you can distill that. Or although tequila is a little bit different, it comes from the heart of a particular kind of agave, the blue agave. Those hearts are cut out, and then they're very slowly roasted and to convert some of the fructans to fructose, a sugar, and then it's mashed up and just fermented and then distilled. By Mexican law, tequila only comes from the state of Jalisco and actually a few nearby communities. Mezcal, on the other hand, is a distilled beverage, alcoholic beverage. It can come from any kind of agave from any part of Mexico. It's interesting that tequila has become famous. It's the more regulated one. Interesting history of this. So the indigenous peoples of Mexico are quite familiar with alcohol, but not with hard alcohol, not with distilled alcohol. And the Spanish colonial authorities prohibited distillation. They really wanted to build up, enhance their own market of exporting wine and brandies from Spain to the New World. But Filipino migrants, about 80,000 Filipinos, moved into Western Mexico during the colonial period. This was part of the Manila galleons. So for several hundred years, Mexico would send its silver to Manila in the Philippines, where it was traded for Chinese silk, porcelain, and a few other goods. And then the ships would come back with that silk and porcelain to New Spain or Mexico, and then much of that went across the Atlantic. So it's a very important trade for centuries, and it was Filipino. The Manila galleons were built in the Philippines. They were mostly staffed by Filipino sailors, and a number of them settled, and they had their own distillation techniques. It's the same kind of still that was used in China. I have an illustration of it soon. What they were used to was tapping palm trees for their sap, fermenting that, and then distilling it. They started doing that in Mexico. The colonial authorities were stamping down on this. So they actually moved into the hills where agave was grown and was used as sap was used as a fermented beverage, and started distilling that, probably to evade authorities. And eventually that gave rise to the mezcal and tequila industries. So you can just see this map showing the situation today, the state of Jalisco and a few communities in a neighboring state where tequila is produced, and then mezcal in a broader area. And then you can just see the Filipino or East Asian, traditional East Asian style still. It's quite different because the condenser is within the main vessel. It's much less efficient, but actually easier and cheaper to use. Now, they've moved on from these stills today, and they're using standard alembics, high-quality stills, but this is how it started. And just to show you a blue agave field for tequila, and then slow roasting those agave hearts to increase your conversion of starch to sugar. And the last beverage I'll talk about is absinthe, which was very popular in the late 1800s, the 19th century, particularly in France, particularly in Paris. Then banned, outlawed, then partially revived. So absinthe is a very strong drink. You can see alcohol by volume up to 74%. So that's much stronger than other distilled spirits. It's flavored particularly with wormwood. Wormwood is a genus Artemisia. It's a close relative of sagebrush, used in medicinals of many kinds, and then a bunch of different herbal flavors, anise, fennel, and so on. So it became very popular, particularly among artists and writers in Paris, sort of bohemians, and it was very much opposed by conservatives due to this association with bohemian culture. But it really started to spread when the vineyards of France were pretty much destroyed in the late 1800s. One thing that globalization brings is a globalization of plants, but also insects, pests, diseases, and the like. And you have grapes growing on both sides of the Atlantic, different species, but same genus. In the Americas, a kind of aphid, the phylloxera, was endemic in wild grapes in the Americas, was not known in Europe, comes in through trade accidentally, spreads over France and other parts of Europe, but mostly France. That's where it particularly caused devastation. It pretty much wiped out the vineyards. So wine drinking culture sort of came to an end, a temporary end. Eventually what wine growers, grape growers in France did was import American rootstock, which had resistance to this pest, and then graft on their own wine varietals on top of that, and to revive the industry. But there was a period of a few decades when wine was very dear and rare, and so absinthe spread, and particularly among the sort of cultural elite bohemian class. Now there's a lot of myths surrounding it. Is often portrayed as very different from other kinds of alcohol, even distilled alcohol. was said to be uniquely addictive, said to be hallucinogenic, to cause seizures. And the scientific reason for this is that it contains a chemical compound called thujone, which, as the Wikipedia notes, and I can just read from the article here, a competitive antagonist of the GABA receptor. It's considered to be a convulsant. It may convey stimulating, mood-elevating effect at low doses. At higher doses, it sort of does become a poison. But it was long thought that this compound made absinthe particularly psychoactive, even hallucinogenic, and particularly dangerous. Modern research has shown that this simply isn't true. The amount of thujone in it was too low to have caused really any kind of mind-altering effects. Really, what absinthism, as it was called, well, it's just chronic alcoholism. It's from people drinking too much of a too strong alcoholic drink. It wasn't because of this particular psychoactive substance in what was sometimes called the green demon. And the last note on this is there was absinthe did not only cause controversy, it also caused scandals in the art world. Edgar Degas' famous painting L'Absinthe, 1876. This was a shocking painting. Critics called it ugly and disgusting. It was actually put in storage and wasn't exhibited again until 1892, again treated with derision. Later would become famous as impressionistic and other forms of experimental art became respectable, but that took a while. And the English critics especially considered it degraded and uncouth, and viewed it as a warning against absinthe, and the French in general, as you could see a very dejected-looking woman, well-dressed, and a more slovenly dressed man sitting next to her. So I'm going to move on. In the second half of this lecture, I'm going to talk about alcohol prohibition movements and then get up a little bit to the present day. So this is a Wikipedia map showing current status. Full alcohol prohibition in countries, or in the case of India, states where alcohol is completely prohibited. All of those countries are Muslim majority countries, and alcohol is, as we talked about in the first lecture, prohibited in Islam, or at least generally considered to be prohibited. Brunei's on there if you look closely. So there's a few others. And then a number of Muslim countries, alcohol is legal for non-Muslims, like in Iran and Sudan and Pakistan and Indonesia, but Muslims are still not legally permitted to drink it. The map also has something called public bans. That may be surprising that there's not a public ban in the United States. Public drinking is illegal almost everywhere in the U.S., but that's a state and local issue. It's not a federal issue. So that's why the map doesn't show it. So most Muslim countries actually do not prohibit alcohol. A few of them do, and a few of them prohibit it for everybody, a few of them just for Muslims. India is interesting. Here it's pushed, alcohol prohibition is pushed by Hindu fundamentalists, if you will, not Muslim fundamentalists, as I talked about before. Hinduism has a pretty low opinion of alcohol, although it varies by caste traditionally. But current prohibition is in 4 states. 2 of those in the Far East, Nagaland and Mizoram, are not Hindu. Nagaland, these are sort of areas on the tribal fringe. Nagaland is mostly, they're both mostly Christian. Nagaland mostly Baptist, Mizoram mostly Presbyterian. But both of those branches of the Christian faith have a certain intensity towards, temperance or prohibition. Gujarat, on the other hand, is Bihar is the poorest state in India and the lowest levels of social development. Gujarat is a relatively prosperous, highly commercial state. And there are several other states where alcohol was prohibited and then they repealed it. Prohibition comes with a lot of problems. Alcohol usually doesn't go away. Revenues are reduced because taxation from alcohol is an important source of revenue. So you often get prohibition coming and going. But note that Mohandas or Mahatma Gandhi wanted national prohibition. The current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, said just a few years ago that alcohol will ruin our society in the next 25 years. Interestingly, both Gandhi and Modi are from Gujarat, western state, where alcohol is illegal and has long been noted for its somewhat more puritanical interpretations of Hindu codes, if you will. This map shows alcohol prohibition, like I say, now and then, and you can see the United States having prohibited alcohol for some 13 years. Canada, Iceland, Norway, Finland, Hungary all had periods. Philippines even a short period, and even late Imperial Russia and early Soviet Union. But all those in that orange color have repealed these bans. Like I say, they tend to come and go. In the United States, there were two main temperance or prohibition movements. The first was in the 1850s. It came quite quickly. It spread to a lot of states and disappeared quite quickly, too. And generally, though, the map shows dry states, also a few territories, but this is generally just for hard liquor. Beer, cider, or wine were often exempted. But you could see it spreading in the 1850s. But by 1863, only 5 states remained dry without the sale of hard liquor. Note the geography. This was primarily New England, as well as New York, as a northern thing, Michigan, Iowa. In the South, you had a few states with local prohibition, so the more western part. But in the Southeast, these states were generally wet. That's the opposite pattern than you get with the second prohibition movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And I just want to show you there was actually a close correlation with what had been the Whig Party, which was the more commercial of the two parties, which was sort of dying out, was being replaced by the Republican Party, also a commercial orientation, but more well noted for its antipathy towards slavery. There was a sort of a certain moralizing or moral fervor that you found in the early Republican Party, associated with abolitionism, but also with prohibition. And so you can see the map of the 1856 U.S. presidential election. This was 4 years before Lincoln was elected as a Republican. So the Republican candidate, this was the first election in which the Republicans had a presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, lost the election, although he did very well. But you could see, if you compare those maps, Fremont won in every state that had prohibition, with the exception of Ohio and Wisconsin. So there was this close association. It was also very closely associated with Protestant Christianity, not with all forms of Protestantism, certainly not with German Lutherans, who were very much in favor of beer drinking, but with many Protestant sects. So this first prohibition movement died out right after the Civil War, but I will note that the consumption of distilled liquor, spirits, plummeted after this. So even though in most places all these prohibitions were lifted, you get from 1860, interesting, you're when the beginning of the Civil War, the election of Abraham Lincoln, but it just plummets and then kind of stabilizes. Note also how beer takes over. You just see this rapid increase in beer consumption, and that was propelled a lot by German immigration. 1848 was a year of massive political uprisings in much of Europe, and certainly in what later became Germany, and that resulted in a big migration stream to the Americas. Germans, both Catholic Germans and Lutheran Germans, brought in their beer drinking tradition and their techniques, and then beer spread to other communities in the U.S., but there's a close connection. So the Prohibition movement picks up again in the late 1800s, and by the early 1900s is successful. It was associated again with Protestant Christianity, accepting groups like German Lutherans. The Episcopalians were never really into it, but Baptists, Methodists, many others were. It's also associated with the women's movement. You can see the Women's Christian Temperance Union, formed in 1874, very important. It became tied up with the movement for women's suffrage. One famous figure in this was Carrie Nation, who was, you can see here, photographed with her famous hatchet, and she would literally go into bars and smash bottles and others. War campaigns like the one in the upper left, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours, which is interesting that they're using the term liquor as they're just referring to hard liquor. They're referring to beer as well. But with the second prohibition movement, which really gained strength in the during World War I, the early 1900s and into World War I, you can see right on the eve of World War I. Well, it started in Europe. The United States was not involved yet. 1915, most of the states with prohibition were in the southeast. Not all. You can see Maine and North Dakota, Arizona as well. But it was was pushed more in the South and the Midwest, parts of the West, whereas the Northeast, which had been the focus of the first prohibition movement, was quite resistant to it. So we could see here by 1919, and this is the year when it passes nationally, that most of the states of New England and the entire mid-Atlantic region were wet at the state level. Some of the counties and cities were dry, as were a number of states in the upper Midwest. The only state in the South that was not dry was, you had Kentucky, border state, and then Louisiana, which is distinctive because southern Louisiana is mostly a Catholic region, and it was a Protestant push for prohibition. This map shows it even better, so it just shows the eve of prohibition, 1917, at the county and town level. And the areas in black are those that are wet. You can see pretty much all of Nevada, which was a very sparsely populated, mostly mining state. Not much agriculture, not much urbanism, but a lot of mines, and miners tend to be heavy drinkers. You can see Louisiana with the southern part, mostly Catholic. Texas, actually, you look at it closely, the very far south and the very far west, heavily Hispanic areas. The German hill country can be seen in central Texas with, I can say German Americans were generally very much opposed to prohibition. Even in Missouri, you can see a large wet area that was heavily German, and Wisconsin as well, and heavy German and Irish populations in the mid-Atlantic states and into New England, and the Irish were also tended to be very much opposed to prohibition. Like I said, it was mostly a Protestant movement. But anyway, in 1919, prohibition passed in the Senate and the House. Note how bipartisan it was. Democrats and Republicans were pretty much on the same page, with the majority favoring it and a minority opposing it. So this wasn't a partisan Democratic or Republican thing at all. It was both parties had their wet and dry branches. So in the Democrats, for example, at the time the Democratic Party was very strong in the South and in the large cities of the Northeast and the manufacturing hubs. And the Southern Democrats tended to be very much in favor of prohibition, and the Northern Democrats very much opposed. So the parties were split. Ultimately, every state but Connecticut and Rhode Island would adopt the 18th Amendment prohibiting alcohol. Government needed a way to enforce its rules, so there was the Volstead Act to try to eliminate saloons and the like, to enforce the 18th Amendment. It is important to note, though, that prohibition always sort of had exceptions. There was an exception for medicinal alcohol. You could literally get a doctor's prescription for hard liquor. And if the doctor gave it to you, and a lot of doctors were doing it, It was very, very similar to when you had medicinal cannabis or marijuana in states like California, and there were doctors who would give you a prescription, if you said you have stress, and there were a number of doctors who did this. So anyway, it was limited though, a pint every 10 days. But then sacramental wine for religious purposes. So there were actually quite a few fake priests and rabbis who get into the game. Interestingly, consumption was never made illegal, only sales, manufacture, or transportation. Now, if you can't make it and you can't buy it, and you can't transport it, well, how do you get it? But former wineries and breweries, a number of them stayed in business because they would sell malt syrup or wine bricks, which didn't have any alcohol, but all you had to do was add the yeast, water and yeast, and then you could make it. And in some states, Maryland for some reason especially, there was relatively little enforcement. According to official data, alcohol consumption plummeted during Prohibition. Now, of course, it's difficult to know the actual numbers because a lot of it was being produced and imported illegally. So there were certainly lots of speakeasies and other places. Alcohol consumption did not go away, obviously. But most scholars think that it really did decline, and there were declines in alcohol-related illnesses like cirrhosis of the liver. So overall consumption did go down, but Prohibition was also associated with a huge increase in organized crime. The U.S. public eventually turned against it when Franklin Roosevelt became president. It was repealed with another constitutional amendment, and then consumption goes back. But Prohibition is not gone entirely. We talked about dry counties in Tennessee and Kentucky. Here's the current situation. It wasn't that long ago where most of Mississippi was dry counties, at least to my knowledge, and now, according to this map, there's not a single Mississippi county that's dry. For some reason, there are a lot in Arkansas, especially, and a few others. It's not just in the South. You could see there are a few dry counties in Kansas, one in South Dakota. That would be on an American Indian reservation where there are issues with it. And there are a lot of yellow counties, even in the north, that have, they're not dry, but they have more restrictions. I'd actually would prefer a map just to show the totally dry ones. And a lot of states have this sort of state control of alcoholic beverages. So in Utah, Kansas, Mississippi, for example, the state controls beer, wine, and distilled spirits. In many states, the blue one, if you want to buy any distilled spirit, you have to go into a state-run store. You can't get it in your grocery store, but you can get wine and beer. So it varies from state to state. As I mentioned before, the percentage of alcohol drinkers in the U.S. has been relatively stable since Prohibition, at least to the extent that we can trust these surveys. You can see in 1976 it was 71%. People who occasionally drink. This is drinking occasionally versus being a total abstainer. So that was 2021 down to 60%, but you can see ups and downs, but not huge differences. Some of the recent polling data indicates that there's been a significant decline in the young drinking and in the old. If you look at this, it's the baby boomers with somewhat less consumption, at least of some classes of alcoholic beverages. I wouldn't put too much faith in this. You can get other articles like this saying that actually older people are binge drinking more. This is during COVID period, which may have something to do with it. As far as your favorite alcoholic beverages, whether it's beer, wine, or hard liquor, we could see beer has been in top place, except briefly in 2005. And then wine, again, we see ups and downs. We see a slight decline in beer. Recently, a slight increase in distilled alcohol, but not much. What I find more interesting are maps like this showing the prevalence of drinking by county. And again, it's hard to know how accurate these are. This usually has to do with people's professed claims, and people are not necessarily honest about things like this, particularly if you're in a region where there's a lot of social pressure against drinking. But on this map, the blue counties have less drinking, the red counties have more. So let's just take it at face value. And some interesting things, I've done some call outs to note these certain patterns that we could see. One is we could see the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church, which is the majority religion in most of Utah and in eastern Idaho as well. So you can see a very consistent blue block of low drinking because of the prevalence of that church, which is quite serious in its prohibition of alcohol. We can see some of the major American Indian reservations in South Dakota show up there, Lakota and other American Plains Indian. So a lot of this is from local restrictions, tribal governments claiming that alcohol is a real problem among our people. We need to restrict it. We can actually see in Arizona and New Mexico, some of those counties also have majority indigenous or Native American population. You can see in the southeast is a very interesting pattern. So this is generally the area that was the core of the second prohibition movement, has the largest proportion of the people belonging to religious denominations, Christian denominations that are opposed to alcohol consumption. It varies though a lot from county to county. So if you look closely, you can pick out a lot of the more urban counties. I put an arrow to the Atlanta metropolitan region. You can also very clearly see in North Carolina, for example, the Raleigh-Durham region. You can pick out cities with in metro areas that have a higher rate of alcohol drinking. There's a very interesting coastal pattern, much higher coastal drinking in these coastal counties. Now, I can easily explain it in southern Louisiana, where historically it's a mostly Roman Catholic region, which is traditionally much more favorably disposed to alcohol than many of the Protestant sects. But note it goes way outside of that, coastal Mississippi and Alabama, coastal South Carolina, North Carolina. So that's an interesting pattern. Florida is distinctive because southern and even central Florida is really not part of the South. Northern Florida is, and you can see a lot of the counties of northern Florida with very low drinking patterns, except some of the coastal ones. So that's kind of interesting. And I also put a question mark over the Appalachian region in the map. It's in Kentucky and West Virginia. These are areas that are not particularly religious. They have low rates of church attendance. They're very poor. It's also the center of the moonshine, or illegal distillation industry in the U.S. And I suspect that drinking actually is much higher there, but it escapes attention because it's not done through sales, legal sales anyway. Also, a lot of maps. This is from the same University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine on binge drinking, prevalence of binge drinking. And you could see, again, very low in Utah and eastern Idaho, very low across the southeast, and a real concentration in the sort of upper western portion of the Midwest into the northern part of the West. So from northern Idaho through Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Wisconsin, a few other areas. There's a real core. Oh, western Colorado too. A lot of those counties, mountainous counties, ski resorts, and other places where you might expect to find quite a bit of drinking. Here's a map that really shows Wisconsin as the center for what they're calling here is heavy binge or heavy drinking. And you can see a lot of it, again, in the same places in Montana and North Dakota, but Wisconsin really stands out on the map. Just this morning, I happened across a map from a site called Terrible Maps, which I had never heard of before. Notice it has a lot of views with the 50 drunkest counties of the United States, and the vast majority of those are in Wisconsin. Wisconsin was very heavily settled by Germans, many parts of Wisconsin anyway. It has a very distinctive political history. It was the center of the progressive political movement in the early 20th century. Today it's very much a purple state, but it does have this long legacy of alcohol consumption, beer particularly, but many other forms as well. I lived in Wisconsin for 1 year, and I very clearly remember an instance when I was visiting a relatively small town, about 3,000 people, and the person I was visiting with said, "Look at the businesses on Main Street here. Let's count how many of them are bars." And it was about 40%. So Wisconsin does have a particular distinct drinking and heavy drinking culture. An irony here, a paradox, is that it also has very low rates of violent crime, of crime in general. Here's a map of the homicide rate, and not just Wisconsin, but much of that larger region of heavy drinking, going into Minnesota, North Dakota, into Montana, also has they all have very low rates of homicide. And there are exceptions. Milwaukee is a bright red county there in Wisconsin. There's one in the north that has a American Indian reservation. Actually, you can see the American Indian reservations in South Dakota with high homicide rates as well. But one would think that a place with a lot of drinking and a lot of binge drinking and over drinking might be associated with higher rates of violent crime and homicide and others. But it doesn't, the data doesn't bear it out. You have very high rates, relatively high rates of homicide across the southeast in many counties that have at least reported very low rates of alcohol consumption. So you just can't get correlations here. Looking at it globally, I'm really suspicious of a lot of this data, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. I'll talk about that in a second. But we could see as far as liters of pure alcohol consumed per person per year, that this is a Wikipedia map, I should note. Europe really stands out as the highest level. You look at that more closely and you see Czech Republic or Czechia, you see Lithuania, you see Moldova. Those are all formerly communist countries, but also high levels in Germany, high levels in France, high levels in Portugal, high levels in Ireland. Much lower levels in the Muslim world, not surprising, sort of in-between levels across most of the Americas, India low, Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia a little higher. Like I say, I'm suspicious of these maps. One reason is you look at different sources and you get very different figures. Here's one from Vivid Maps showing liters of pure alcohol per person per year, and it has Belarus and Moldova at the top. But Russia very, very high, lower rates in much of Europe, higher rates in Canada than the United States, higher in Australia. It's hard to get data on this. You can look at what's purchased, you can look at, and you can get numbers on that, but in a lot of the world, people are making their own alcohol, certainly true in Africa, for example. Here's a map showing disability life years for alcohol use disorders, and it has Russia on the top, which is more what I would expect, because there is a lot of evidence that, especially vodka binge drinking is associated with a lot of health and behavioral problems, and that is more of an issue in Russia than other places. Note showing it's very low for Africa, even for countries like Nigeria, that on a map like this, Nigeria is shown as very high. But you just have to, the poorer a country is generally, the more suspicious its data becomes, because it has a hard time just keeping track of this. For example, here's a Wikipedia table with the highest levels of alcohol consumption, supposedly. 2016, you can see Moldova, a Romanian-speaking country between Romania and Ukraine. And we have Lithuania, former Soviet republic, Czech Republic, formerly part of Czechoslovakia, Seychelles, That's a tourist-heavy country in the Indian Ocean. Then we have Germany. Then we have Nigeria. But look at Nigeria from 1966 to 2016. Just this huge increase. Well, I'm pretty suspicious of that. I'm entirely suspicious of it. I just don't believe it. So, take these with a grain of salt. For the lowest, according to Wikipedia, we have a lot of countries with no consumption of alcohol. You can see Saudi Arabia with just, hardly any, but then you get down to Bangladesh, Kuwait, Libya, Mauritania, Somalia, all Muslim countries, no alcohol consumed at all. Well, that's undoubtedly untrue. It's just how much. Bangladesh, until recently, alcohol was illegal, and so the government simply said it's illegal here. You can't consume it, so it's not consumed. Well, that's a convenient myth. In 2022, interesting, Bangladesh liberalized its alcohol law and now allows it to be sold in hotels, restaurants. You can get a special liquor license, but anyone over 21 will be allowed to apply for a permit. Muslims over 21 must get a prescription for a doctor with a minimum rank of associate professor. That's kind of interesting. So I'm nearing the end here, but a few more points I want to make. Alcohol preference, we saw that map for Europe. We see one globally. Interesting, you can see Southern South America, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay as preferring wine. And yes, those are major wine producing and consuming countries. I found it really, the other for much of Africa, this is going to mostly be home-produced alcoholic beverages of various sorts. Hard to enumerate. Saudi Arabia, we have showing it as spirits, and I'd say yes, that's actually, or distilled beverages. I'd say that's probably entirely accurate, but Saudi Arabia is a country that officially doesn't allow alcohol certainly for its Muslim population. But simply because it's forbidden doesn't mean it's not consumed. In Saudi Arabia, elite Saudis, wealthy Saudis have long favored distilled spirits. But in fact, there's a little country called Bahrain. Well, I should jump the slide here. It's in the Persian Gulf. It's very small. It's an independent country, and it is connected with Saudi Arabia by what is officially called the King Fahd Causeway. This used to be called the Johnny Walker Bridge because so many Saudis would travel to Bahrain, just drive over. And Bahrain used to be very open about alcohol and allow it to be bought and sold. Bahrain, on the other hand, has really tightened up, particularly, first they banned alcohol altogether. That was devastating to their tourism industry. The ban was later removed for non-Muslims, particularly tourists. But it's no longer so easy to go across the Johnny Walker Bridge from Saudi Arabia to Bahrain. And just one other comment here. I once knew a graduate student who was working in Bahrain for his dissertation, and he talked about his favorite restaurant in Bahrain that served what they called the Saudi special. And it wasn't Johnny Walker. It was champagne along with spare ribs, both prohibited by Islam. But just because a religion prohibits something doesn't mean that people follow those prohibitions. Just a few more slides here. Trends in alcohol consumption globally. It's interesting to see the very substantial decline in consumption, particularly in France in blue, and Italy with that green dashed line. So these were countries where a couple generations ago, most people would be drinking wine with lunch and with dinner. It was a culture that really emphasized drinking wine rather than spirits, drinking while you're eating, while you're socializing, very different from the throwing back shots of strong alcohol that you would find in a place like Russia. Much less dangerous, but still very high levels of consumption, extremely high by today's standards, and those have dropped considerably. Again, if we have to take this data with a grain of salt, but the data we have suggests that in many countries, alcohol consumption has gone down. This shows it for Russia, for the United Kingdom, for Canada, for Australia. But then in a number of Asian countries in particular, but also including the United States, it has supposedly increased. And this was just from 2010 to 2017. And a huge increase in Vietnam. Vietnam is moving from a very poor to a middle income country. It may be associated with this. Again, I think there are things to be skeptical of. And finally, my last slide, I want to end with this paradox that I had talked about in the United States, because you can find it globally to a certain extent. People who are opposed to alcohol, who emphasize the health damage and social damage that it causes, the ravages of alcoholism and the like, really think this is a dangerous substance that should be greatly restricted, if not outlawed altogether. But if you compare maps of alcohol consumption, something called like the Human Development Index of the UN, which looks at economic, educational, health aspects with this composite index, we find that a lot of the countries that have very high levels of alcohol consumption, particularly in Western and Central Europe, also have very high rates of human development. So the correlation, it's not particularly strong. You have Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, they have high levels of human development. Japan is intermediate in alcohol and has very high levels. So it's not a causal relationship, but you certainly cannot link high levels of alcohol consumption at the level of the independent state with any sort of social developmental problems. So just an interesting thing to consider. It's a very paradoxical substance, as I mentioned in the first lecture. So I hope you enjoyed this. I will be moving on to, I believe, caffeine, tea and coffee will be the next lecture. Thank you.